an international investigation into the crackdown.
The international community is speaking with one voice, and our message is unmistakable. These violations of universal rights are unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
Even the countries who usually put state sovereignty over human rights lined up in agreement over the weekend, approving sanctions against Colonel Gaddafi and his entourage, as well as possible prosecution for war crimes.
And so, to Colonel Gaddafi, we say this: the Libyan people are saying go, the people of the Arab world are saying go, the peoples of the entire world are saying go, and for the sake of humanity, go now.
But if there is rare diplomatic unity over Libya, there is also recognition that much more needs to be done, that this is also a humanitarian crisis. The head of the International Red Cross told AlJazeera that some of the elementary rules of armed conflict are not being followed.
We have seen that. We have credible report about ambulances being used to carry weapons or things like that, and that's a very major concern, because I think we think that's a question of life and death. Medical staff, ambulances need to be respected. They need to be able to do their work. It's not the case so far in Libya, especially not in the western part of Libya. And I really call to every people involved in violence to be able to really allow us to do our work and to allow all humanitarians to do their work in Libya. That's very important.
The U.S. is pushing Europe to take a lead role in the crisis, and the EU on Monday agreed to apply the UN sanctions. There is a recognition as well that the humanitarian and refugee crisis developing in Libya could affect Europe.
We're trying to respond in real time to the crisis and, of course, to avoid the civil war that we fear, and making contingency plans to respond to the potential flow of refugees to neighbouring and to European countries.
Sanctions and rhetoric, however rapid, will only take the world so far. Already some are saying military action may be needed, a far bigger challenge if the international community is to stay united. Nick Spicer, AlJazeera, Geneva.
Well, in Britain, Prime Minister David Cameron told Parliament his country would work to establish a no-fly zone in Libya.
We must not tolerate this regime using military force against its own people. And in that context, I've asked the Ministry of Defence and the Chief of Defence Staff to work with our allies on plans for a military no-fly zone. Mr. Speaker, it is clear this is an illegitimate regime that has lost the consent of its people, and our message to Colonel Gaddafi is simple: go now.
And joining me now to discuss the legal moves involved in a no-fly zone is Michael Patchett-Joyce. He's a lawyer based here in London. Thanks for coming into the programme, Michael. Let's go back to basics. Under international law, what is required to be put in place before a no-fly zone can be established?
Essentially, I think it will demand a UN Security Council resolution. This goes back to the responsibility to protect, which was clearly established by the UN back in 2005 in their World Report. And this allows action to be taken when there are extreme human rights abuses amounting to genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. Those are the categories that have to, or one of those categories has to be satisfied in order for the responsibility to protect to be brought into action.
Because technically, of course, any aircraft that go into airspace over Libya are flying through sovereign territory, aren't they?
That's right, and ordinarily one would think that an independent state has a right to non-intervention. As a result of the responsibility to protect, that right yields in these particular circumstances to an overriding right to protect the population which is not being protected by its own country.
Should the UN Security Council decide that a no-fly zone is vital, how quickly can it be established legally?
There is a requirement that it should be timely and decisive action. So therefore it should be acting more quickly than the circumstances demand, because obviously if it acts more slowly, then it's not going to be timely action, it's not going to be decisive action.
What about the limits that are placed? I mean, presumably it all comes down to what is actually worded in the resolution itself? Because we all talk about a no-fly zone, but actually what it means can be quite different depending on the wording, can't it?
Well, I think that the clearer the wording of any resolution, obviously the better it is, because that sends a very clear signal to the Libyan regime as to what they can, or more clearly what they cannot do. The no-fly zone would be either over the entirety of the Libyan airspace or over particular parts of Libyan airspace, and it would require that there were no military flights over that particular zone, whether it's helicopters or planes.
All right, must leave it there. Michael Patchett-Joyce, thanks so much for explaining that to us. Thank you. Well, now, Hillary Clinton's call for Gaddafi to step down has marked a further hardening of the US's stance against the Libyan regime. More on that. Let's cross to Nick Clark. He's in our Washington, D.C. News Centre. Nick.
Yeah, thanks very much, Felicity. Hillary Clinton said that, quotes, all options remain on the table in regards to Libya. And now the US Treasury says it's frozen at least $30 billion in Libyan assets since last week. Officials say the asset freeze is the largest ever, mandated by a US sanctions order. Well, the news came after US President Barack Obama met the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the White House for talks on Libya. And speaking in the last half hour, the US ambassador to the United Nations, that's Susan Rice, was unambiguous about what the US government wants Gaddafi to do next. She said his actions had left the UN Security Council with little choice but to act.
When he can laugh in talking to American and international journalists while he is slaughtering his own people, it only underscores how unfit he is to lead and how disconnected he is from reality. I think we have been very, very clear about what is right and what is moral in this situation and what has been unacceptable and inexcusable violence. And we have taken very strong and very swift actions to confront that.
Let's speak to Patty Culhane joining us now to talk about this. Patty, the US might have been pretty reticent about this from the start, but now there seems to be no holds barred.
And she was answering a question there about what took the United States 9 days. Where was President Obama? Where was the outrage? It's not as if the violence started and then the president spoke out. But she did have some strong language. She called Colonel Gaddafi delusional and really made clear what their strategy is. All of these threats, they're not sending them necessarily to Colonel Gaddafi. I think they've pretty much given up hope that he's going to leave, although they have raised the idea of exile. Still, there'd be punishment, according to the Secretary of State. He could leave the country, but they would try to follow him with repercussions for his actions. They're very clearly trying to send a message to his inner circle. They are trying to get them to turn on Gaddafi, threatening things like the U.S. intelligence getting involved. They are basically eavesdropping. They are keeping an eye. They are gathering evidence, and they say they will face war crimes trials if the violence continues. So it's very clear what their strategy is today.
Right. And tell us, Patty, about the U.S. Military assets in the region, how they might be deployed in the region.
You know, this is very interesting. Last week, I was speaking to my sources at the Pentagon. I said, what is the U.S. military doing? And they were doing absolutely nothing. They hadn't received any requests to start moving in that direction. Well, now we're told that officially they have started moving some ships and some planes to the Mediterranean so they can be on standby either for humanitarian help or for that no-fly zone. So which ships? Now, obviously, the U.S. military doesn't usually say exactly who's moving, but if you know where the ships have been, and I do, and you can see where they've moved to, it's pretty clear to me that the USS Enterprise, which is a pretty aged aircraft carrier, but it's still an effective aircraft carrier, seems to be heading in that direction. And also the USS Kearsarge, that's an amphibious ship. It has two other amphibious ships alongside it. And that, interestingly, has some Marines on board. Not all of the Marines, some went into Afghanistan, but it seems to me that those are the ships that are moving in that direction. And obviously, if the U.S. was to get involved with the no-fly zone, they're indicating they want to see the NATO vote on it before they would get involved. But if the U.S. was to institute a no-fly zone, I can tell you I've spent months and months on U.S. aircraft carriers. Pretty much an aircraft carrier is capable of at least flying a majority of the coverage.
And Patty, it's interesting how the U.S. is now directing all its energy, putting its energy through the United Nations with Clinton in Geneva, and meanwhile the relative chiefs, Ban Ki-moon and Barack Obama, of course, putting their heads together here in Washington.
And it's very clear that the U.S. does not want this to be seen as a U.S. mission. From when they began speaking out about it, which again was 9 days in, they immediately started saying, we want to speak with an international voice. We do not want this to be seen as a U.S. mission. They think that would undermine any of the opposition groups. Now, at the same time, U.S. officials say they are speaking to the opposition groups, and this was very interesting because there's been some suggestion that the U.S. could look to arm some of those groups that are hoping to oppose Gaddafi. And so that was a question to Ambassador Rice, and I want to point this out. She said it's too premature to talk about that because it's not clear which opposition groups are going to emerge the leader. So they're really not dismissing the suggestion they could arm the opposition. They're just saying they're not going to do it just yet.
Yeah, everything on the table, it seems. Paddy Culhane in Washington, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to Aaron David Miller. He's a former State Department official who's worked on the Middle East and Arab-Israeli negotiations. And I asked him whether the crisis in Libya could lead to international military intervention.
It's not like Lebanon, where this could be tripped into a regional confrontation, but clearly there's a moral imperative here. Innocent people are dying, trying to resist Gaddafi. There's an oil factor, of course, which has seen a spike in oil prices, and if it should spread, it could cause serious dislocation to the international community. But this seems to me containable, and it comes down to one basic dynamic. Gaddafi has mercenaries, he has money. He has the capacity to hold Tripoli for quite some time unless somebody, either internal Libyan opposition and or with the help of international support, dislodges him. Remember, the key here is not to change Gaddafi's calculations, presumably. Let's assume he's not leaving. The key is to change the calculations of those around him. And upping the ante with the prospects of military intervention, I just don't see why a no-fly zone at this stage is going to bring any more pressure against Gaddafi and dislodge him from Tripoli. The issue is how to get him out of his bunker. And that can only be done in two ways. One, you could have opposing forces enter the city, fight a pitched battle, and defeat him. Or two is the possibility of assassinating him, either from within his own circle or from the outside. And no one is considering that.
That's Aaron David Miller there. Let's get some Canadian perspective on this, a country that has imposed its own sanctions against Libya, going further than those passed by the UN Security Council, in fact, on Saturday. In addition to freezing the assets of Gaddafi, his 5 children and top associates, the Canadian government has banned any financial transactions with the Libyan government and institutions. And Canadian media are reporting that the Gaddafi regime unsuccessfully tried to withdraw a substantial amount of money from several banks in Canada. Prime Minister Stephen Harper explained what was being done.
These actions will help restrict the movement of and access to money and weapons for those responsible for violence against the Libyan people. As you know, Canada also called for the referral of the situation in Libya to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to help ensure that those responsible for ordering and carrying out atrocities are held accountable.
That's Stephen Harper, and that's it from me for now. Back a little bit later. Anad.
Thanks, Nick. Egypt's former president Hosni Mubarak has not been heard from since he stepped down last month, but now the spotlight's back on the former leader. Egypt's public prosecutor has issued a travel ban on him and his family and put a freeze on their financial assets. Ayman Mohideen has more.
Forced out of office and now in the crosshairs of Egypt's prosecutor general. On Monday, former President Hosni Mubarak and his family were banned from traveling abroad and all of their financial assets and property in Egypt frozen pending further investigation. Mubarak and his family had reportedly accumulated billions of dollars in wealth during their 30 years in power in both domestic and foreign assets. The president's 2 sons, Ala and Gamal, were widely believed to have exploited their family ties for personal financial gains. Holding Mubarak and his former regime accountable is important if Egypt is to make a break from its past.
I think it's a very positive decision, one of the demands of the revolution, which pushes it forward and reassures the people to a great extent, especially these investigations in corruption.
Shortly after Mubarak left office, Egypt's foreign ministry requested foreign governments and financial institutions to freeze all foreign assets belonging to Mubarak's family. The travel ban and freeze is being imposed nearly 3 weeks after Mubarak stepped down, leaving some to question the prosecutor's intentions.
This is a positive step, but very late. It should have been taken when the prosecutor issued his decision to freeze Mubarak's assets abroad, and even before then, because it has given Mubarak time to smuggle his assets out of the country.
Mubarak is the most senior official of the previous regime, who is now under investigation for illegal activity. Similar travel bans and investigations have been launched into several top officials.